As you're aware, on Thursday, Uganda was reviewed by the UN Human Rights Council, where all member states look at each other's records. This was Uganda's third time. And Uganda went and presented a defense of its human rights record. It said things like, when COVID-19 came, it chose life above all else. It said there were no extrajudicial killings. It said it was doing really well on economic social rights, and that it would continue to progress. As human rights organizations on the ground, we first of all were glad that Uganda submitted a report. Sometimes countries don't. And as civil society, we got our chance to also send in our reports, and so did the Uganda Human Rights Commission. But I think Uganda's human rights record, it is evident, is really, really wanting. I was struck when it talked about it would talk about improving economic social rights almost as this banner that shows how well it's doing. But the reality on the ground is different. 1 in 5 Ugandans earn below the poverty line. And they say that is about $1, 3,000 something a day. We have really a real lack of functional public health facilities. And the result of this we saw in June and July last year, where people died, not because of COVID, but because there was no oxygen, there were no staff. And this has been the reality for a while. You know, mothers go to give birth and there is no one to attend to them, or there are no drugs and they're dying. Uganda talked about improvement in maternal mortality rates, but a minibus of women die every single day trying to bring life into this world. We saw the same thing with education. Uganda, of course, boasted about UPE and access to education, but during COVID-19, we really education went into crisis because of everything that was shut down. But even after reopening schools right now, some of you have your children at home because you just didn't have money, and there is no functional public school system. So right now, the reality in Uganda is you need money to be able to make sure your child can go to school, because the UPE schools are there, but they will lack basics. They will lack enough classrooms, sitting space, teachers. It talked a bit about social protection, which was a key thing that came through. A lot of the states were asking Uganda to prioritize social protection measures. And again, we can talk about COVID-19 affecting the country's flow of finances. But even before COVID-19, only 2% of government's expenditure went to social protection. And yet we see that when we have a shock like COVID-19, so many people are out of work, you give cash transfers, money is taken. So those issues really made us question just again how honest we are being about our shortcomings, because we should be honest that we are not delivering for our people. And when people talk about human rights in this country and the failures in human rights, they will think about the extrajudicial killings or detention, but they won't think about the systematic deprivation of health, education as a human rights issue. So for me, I was really glad, and Isa was really glad as civil society to see that member states were now prioritizing these economic social rights in their recommendations. One of the things we set out to do when getting into this process and coordinating civil society around this was to see strong recommendations around economic social rights. COVID-19 has shown us you can no longer ignore your health, education, social protection systems. On the other hand, Uganda talked about, and we can commend it for that, passing a national action plan on business and human rights. It was a recommendation from the cycle before that it actually implemented. It worked very closely with civil society organizations who are also included among that group. But now we don't want it to stop at policy level. You know, as a country, we're very good at policies. So the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, seeing it implemented would definitely go a wrong way. But generally, it's also telling that even as Uganda was going for this third review, it was supposed to have had a National Action Plan on Human Rights. We have not seen it. It's not publicly available because it has not been passed. They've worked on it. It was a recommendation from 2011. So there are a lot of recommendations which Uganda has not done from before. And I think it should have been very good for the country to come out honestly and say, these are our constraints. You know, this is why, despite our best efforts, we can't seem to ensure that everyone has quality education. And of course, Uganda is going to have a chance to accept these recommendations. Once it has accepted the recommendations, then it must implement them. and we'll continue to monitor that. But as a whole, I thought that, that the member states at least raised different issues that were of concern, particularly by civil society. I've talked about the economic social rights issues, but even things like the shrinking space for NGOs and strengthening the legal framework. We know we still struggle with rights like health in the Constitution being strongly enshrined. And now you're in the middle of a pandemic, you're trying to introduce public health measures, you're trying to strengthen the health systems, but you don't have a strong legal obligation for that. So as a whole, we hope that this is a wake-up call to Uganda. As civil society, we will continue to point out government's failures, but we'll also continue to work to think through how to implement these recommendations. In 2016, ISA worked with government to come up with indicators and benchmarks, because sometimes you get recommendations, and we've seen a lot of them right now saying, strengthen the health system. But what are the benchmarks? What does it mean to strengthen the health system? And so, you know, Uganda already has indicators from the SDGs. It already has development processes. So it can do this, but is there a political will? I think, again, for many Ugandans right now, we are seeing a lot of policies and words with very little implementation. Because for an economy to work for people, for human rights to have meaning, it should be self-evident. You go to a health facility, there are drugs. You need to send your child, regardless of money to pay, they can go to school, you know. You shouldn't be hearing the recent things we've been hearing in the news recently. So I think that the political will, you know, the evidence of political will is where you put your money. And right now, we're in a budget process. You recently heard about the women parliamentarians that were talking about cuts the health budget and how that was an issue. People were in a pandemic. How is this even a conversation again? And so I think that, that we should be able to see, proof should be in the pudding. You know, are we seeing these things happening? And so I task government, if it is getting serious about its service delivery, about all the things it says in the National Development Plan, it needs to step up, put the money there. Let us see functional, strong, quality public services. Let us have respect for human rights. And it's a thing that has continuously come up. So I think the political will for me is still lacking. But it's also a wake-up call to us as Ugandans. These are rights. When you're entitled to something, if someone comes to take it, you fight back. So we need to make sure that we continue to ask and continue to demand, because the government has a social contract with us. And part of that social contract is to ensure these rights, these functional public services, this social protection. So we need to continue to demand it, because the political will, in my opinion, is yet to match what's on the ground. It remains to be seen if the country accepts those recommendations. There was a statement where they said they were really reasserting their sovereignty as a country, and also that certain rights may not be culturally appropriate, but I think they're talking about also a whole host of other rights. So it will be, first of all, they have to accept to implement them. But you're right, it's of increasing concern. I mean, the space within which to critique and to question has been increasingly shrinking. And so, again, for all recommendations for me, it really comes down to political will. And I want to know, at some point, Uganda does have to come and address each of those recommendations. And the same thing with, again, the censorship of people who are saying things that are not favorable, and all that is happening. And I think we've been talking about 36 years of NRM. So if we're really going to live up to the ideals, to the promises, the things that are in the manifestos and the documents, you need to get serious about human rights. You can't have development without human rights. The thing about the UPR is it's supposed to continue to start this dialogue. So that's why I say to you that from the way the process is designed, civil society, Human Rights Commission, UN should be able to give their views. So when you come back, you're supposed to actually have, and government of Uganda must do this, consult with the different stakeholders on how best to implement these recommendations. Because you're right, there is the question of whether they just stay there, then every 5 years you come back and you make some generic statement. And some people did think that. Some people did think about certain rights. I know someone who said maybe they should just come and say we are sorry. I know that in coming up with this report, they did consult civil society, right? But government also works very differently, and I think we need to see a whole of government approach if we're going to see any traction on this. You know, it's not going to be you're just dealing with justice or you're just dealing with Ministry of Health, like Prime Minister's office. It has to be a whole of government approach, because if one arm of government is doing something contrary to the recommendations, then it undermines what you're trying to do. And when Uganda went up there, it said that it is one of the things it's proud about is implementing a human rights-based approach. And that should cut across. But also, more importantly, I think, again, the issues that were raised are not niche issues. Ugandans were, just 2 weeks ago, Ugandans were shouting about the state of the education system, right? They've been shouting about the health system last year. So ISA has sued and a number of other organizations, and even individuals, even this year, on education, on health, on social protection. So these are not foreign issues. These are issues that are here. It is in government's interest to identify them. And if you look at government reports, they will range, whether from the economic, social rights, or access to justice issues, or the government reports, they leave breadcrumbs that show you these are issues. So for us to have a peaceful society, for us to have sustainable recovery from COVID-19, government must prioritize these recommendations.